We often take pride in saying that Canada was the first country in the world to adopt multiculturalism as official policy. It's a point of national identity, symbolizing our commitment to valuing all citizens, no matter their racial, ethnic, linguistic, or religious background. But multiculturalism isn't a fixed concept. It's constantly evolving. So what exactly does multiculturalism mean today? Is it a legal right, a policy, a political ideology that shifts depending on who's in power? For some, it's about food, dance, and costume, the stuff of folk festivals and annual multicultural days. For others, it's a push toward inclusion, particularly of groups who've been historically marginalized. But multiculturalism isn't embraced by everyone in the same way. Some people see it as a challenge to what they perceive as their Canada, raising deeper questions about identity and belonging. Two things are clear, though. First, we're unlikely to ever agree on a single definition of multiculturalism. Second, that shouldn't stop us from continuing to shape it together. Ongoing debate is necessary, not just about what multiculturalism looks like, but about whether it's truly working. And as immigration continues to change the face of Canadian society, our conversations must also evolve to ensure that inclusion and equity aren't just ideals, but lived realities. Canada's proximity to the United States has always shaped our sense of identity. Living beside a global giant can make Canada feel like it's in orbit around a much larger planet. That's why Canadians often define themselves, consciously or not, by what they are not. This includes how we view immigration and multiculturalism. Polls show that multiculturalism is seen by Canadians as a fundamental national value, something that sets us apart. People are quick to distinguish our multiculturalism from theirs. That difference often gets boiled down to two models, the mosaic and the melting pot. In Canada, we often describe ourselves as a mosaic. This model encourages newcomers to maintain their cultural identities while coexisting with others. In contrast, the melting pot, associated with the U.S., suggests that newcomers should assimilate and blend into a dominant culture, shedding their differences. These models reflect broader ideologies about integration. The mosaic model implies a more inclusive stance where differences are celebrated, provided they align with Canadian laws and values. But here's the catch. When we look at how multiculturalism actually plays out in daily life, the contrast between the two models isn't always so clear-cut. In practice, both Canada and the U.S. face similar challenges in achieving true cultural pluralism. This section sets up an important conversation, not just about how we define ourselves as Canadians, but how these ideas shape policies, expectations, and experiences for newcomers. The idea of multiculturalism has come under heavy scrutiny globally, especially across Europe. In 2010, German Chancellor Angela Merkel declared multiculti had failed, arguing that merely living side by side wasn't enough, and that immigrants needed to integrate more actively. This reflected a growing wave of anti-immigration sentiment, not just from the political right, but also from the left. In places like France, the UK, and the Netherlands, incidents of violence and civil unrest, whether race riots or terrorist attacks, fueled a backlash. In some cases, like France, it's worth noting that they never adopted multiculturalism in the first place, instead enforcing strict assimilation. The Netherlands, once known for tolerance, reversed course, requiring immigrants to pass value-based tests to prove cultural compatibility. Against this backdrop, Canada often appears as a success story. Internationally, we're viewed as a model of integration, welcoming, diverse, and peaceful. But is that image fully accurate? Critics argue Canada's version of multiculturalism isn't without issues. Some say it encourages people to retreat into ethnic enclaves. Others claim it promotes stereotypes by turning cultures into costumes or food festivals. Even some immigrants reject being boxed into ethnic categories, instead valuing interaction across cultures. Interestingly, a 2010 poll showed that nearly half of Canadians think immigrants should abandon their customs and assimilate. This view challenges the very foundation of Canadian multiculturalism, which was designed to let people retain their cultural identities while becoming part of Canadian society. And while we often boast of successful outcomes for immigrants, it may be less about our multicultural model and more about our immigration system, one that selects educated, skilled individuals who are already positioned for success. Refugees and undocumented migrants are a much smaller part of Canada's migration landscape compared to countries with land borders or coastal entry points. So we're left with difficult questions. Is multiculturalism still working in Canada? Or has it become a system that, rather than promoting integration, keeps people separated under the guise of inclusion? Canada's multiculturalism can be understood in two main ways: descriptively and prescriptively. Descriptively, it's undeniable that Canada is one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world. In 2011, Statistics Canada reported people of over 200 ethnic origins living here. More than 200 languages are spoken in Canadian homes, some of which have moved beyond the private sphere into public spaces like street signs and storefronts. This diversity is evident whether you're in large cities like Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal, or in smaller, more remote communities. But this demographic reality, this diversity, is not a moral stance. It's simply a fact. Prescriptively, multiculturalism is a political and social response to that diversity. It's a framework, a policy approach for how we manage differences. This is where Canada's multicultural policy plays a unique role. It sets out to ensure that people can retain their cultural identities and still be full, equal participants in Canadian society. However, it's important to clear up a common misconception. Multiculturalism does not mean anything goes. All people in Canada, regardless of cultural background, are expected to follow Canadian laws. Cultural relativism does not override legal standards. Before multiculturalism, Canada operated under an Anglo or Franco conformity model. Immigrants were expected to assimilate, especially to British norms. There were explicit policies against non-British, non-French ethnic groups, including restrictive immigration quotas and laws like Section 38 of the 1910 Immigration Act, which barred immigrants unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada. These were coded racial exclusions, especially targeting those from warm climates, meaning visible minorities. This was a time when official policy openly discouraged diversity. The demographic shift started in the 1960s with the introduction of a non-racist, points-based immigration system. However, multiculturalism as policy didn't arise simply because Canada became more diverse. Ironically, it was Quebec nationalism that helped trigger the move. In an effort to prevent Quebec's secession during the Quiet Revolution, the federal government under Lester B. Pearson promoted bilingualism and biculturalism, enshrined in the 1969 Official Languages Act. But these efforts alarmed other ethnic communities, Ukrainians, Germans, Jews, and others, who worried about being excluded in a bilingual Canada that only recognized French and English cultures. In response, these groups advocated for broader recognition, and the government commissioned a report on their contributions. This advocacy led to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's 1971 speech declaring multiculturalism an official policy, emphasizing that no culture was more official than another. From there, we saw two major phases in the evolution of multiculturalism. One, the formative stage, 1971 to 1985, focused on cultural preservation, funding festivals, language programs, and the arts. But this stage mostly ignored Indigenous, Black, and long-established minority communities. Number two, the expansionist or institutional stage, post-1985. The 1988 Multiculturalism Act gave legal authority to multicultural policy. It focused on equality and reducing discrimination. Laws like the 1986 Employment Equity Act recognized systemic barriers and emphasized not just equal treatment, but equitable outcomes. That meant recognizing and accommodating differences. A major review in 1996 concluded that it wasn't enough for immigrants to do all the integrating. Majority groups also had a responsibility to be more inclusive. Government programs began tying funding to results like improved equity for racialized and marginalized communities. Still, multiculturalism had not been without its critics. Budget cuts and public backlash followed, including claims of reverse discrimination. Today, the promotion of multiculturalism is handled by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, not a department focused broadly on cultural affairs. which speaks to some of the policy's narrowed scope in recent years. So, while multiculturalism in Canada may have started as a pragmatic political strategy, it evolved into a guiding framework for managing cultural diversity, one that continues to be debated, reshaped, and sometimes contested. Canada is often celebrated as a global success story when it comes to multiculturalism. We've maintained strong economic performance, democratic stability, and high personal freedoms, all while accepting large numbers of immigrants. Canadians tend to take pride in this, quietly wondering why other Western countries, despite similar diversity, seem to face greater tensions and failures. In fact, prominent leaders like Nelson Mandela and international bodies such as the United Nations have publicly praised Canada's approach. The key indicators back this up: high rates of intermarriage, widespread citizenship uptake, strong acquisition of English or French, and high levels of political participation from immigrant communities. However, some scholars suggest our success is less about policy and more about context. Unlike countries with large, undocumented populations or sudden refugee influxes, Canada selects most immigrants through a careful system. Our geography limits illegal migration, and we tend to welcome the best educated and most prepared newcomers. Still, multiculturalism has shifted. Originally, it referred to white ethnics, Europeans who were already relatively similar to the dominant population in terms of language, religion, and cultural norms. These groups brought minor differences like food or clothing, but were not seen as clashing with core Canadian values. Today, multiculturalism includes a much wider range of visible minorities, some of whom practice traditions that raise legal and ethical questions in Canada, like female genital mutilation or honor-based violence. This has fueled discomfort even among earlier immigrant groups, some of whom resent newer arrivals for seemingly benefiting from rights they had to fight for. These tensions highlight the ongoing challenge. How do we balance cultural respect with legal and ethical standards? Sociologist Irene Blomrod compared Vietnamese and Portuguese immigrants in Toronto and Boston and found that even with similar backgrounds, the Canadians felt more at home and civically engaged. Her conclusion? Canada's institutionalized multiculturalism played a key role in making immigrants feel like they belonged. Still, Canada's demographic shift is accelerating. By 2031, 1 in 4 Canadians will be foreign-born, with over half of those from Asia. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, visible minorities will make up well over half the population. But what happens when minorities become the majority? Does the idea of a cohesive national identity lose meaning? Ethnic enclaves are part of this discussion. These concentrated cultural communities, Chinatown, Little India, Little Italy, offer support, reduce culture shock, and enrich Canada's social landscape. In 1981, there were only 6. Today, there are over 260, with half in Vancouver alone. These are mostly enclaves of choice, not of poverty or forced segregation as in parts of Europe or the US. That said, critics worry that enclaves can reinforce separation, limit language acquisition, and reduce national cohesion. Some enclaves support their own schools, cutting off one of the fastest routes to civic integration. Even though most Canadian immigrants perform well on metrics like home ownership and citizenship, newer immigrants now earn only 61 cents for every dollar earned by Canadian-born workers. Economic mobility has declined. There are also social challenges. High-profile crimes like the 2007 murder of Aqsa Parvez or ethnic gang violence among Punjabi and Somali communities spark fears of cultural defense being used in court and fuel calls to reevaluate multiculturalism. Some argue that these incidents reflect the failure of integration, not isolated acts. Ultimately, Canada's multiculturalism works well in many ways, but it's not immune to criticism, complexity, or consequence. The question isn't just whether multiculturalism works, but for whom and under what conditions. And as demographics shift and political discourse hardens, it's clear the conversation is far from over. As we look ahead, a key issue in the multiculturalism debate is the lack of a clear, shared definition. Critics often claim that multiculturalism has become a tool for political correctness and that it weakens a unified Canadian identity. Some argue it divides the population into cultural silos, and stifles national dialogue by categorizing people based on ethnicity rather than shared citizenship. There are concerns that multicultural policies, instead of encouraging meaningful cross-cultural conversation, actually prevent it by placing individuals into static ethnic identities. At the political level, there have even been efforts in the past to eliminate funding for multicultural programs and dissolve related departments. Despite this, many Canadians continue to view multiculturalism as a central part of the national identity. The majority of recent immigrants report a strong sense of belonging to Canada, which suggests that something about the system is working. However, that doesn't mean everything is perfect. Discrimination is still reported by a significant portion of racialized Canadians, and poverty rates among these groups remain disproportionately high. Public opinion reflects this tension. While multiculturalism is widely supported, a substantial portion of the population believes it has had negative effects. More than half of those polled say they would prefer a melting pot approach where cultural differences are absorbed over the mosaic model Canada is known for. In light of these mixed views, some are calling for changes in how multiculturalism is practiced. Suggestions include focusing on programs that build shared spaces, places where people from different backgrounds interact regularly, not just maintain separate heritage groups. These forums could promote stronger bonds of citizenship and mutual understanding. Others argue that we should move away from assigning people to ethnic categories altogether and instead focus on shared values and experiences. This view emphasizes the idea that people may feel deeper connections through common interests, beliefs, or creativity than through shared ancestry. Another perspective promotes balance, respecting cultural diversity while acknowledging that no group should be exempt from Canada's laws and moral standards. The idea is that multiculturalism should not mean tolerating harmful practices simply because they are culturally rooted. It also calls for moving away from measuring all cultural groups against a white Anglo-Canadian norm. Recent studies have shown evidence of persistent systemic bias. For example, resumes with English-sounding names tend to get more responses than those with ethnic names. In another case, public feedback on a proposed image for Canadian currency rejected a scientist who appeared too Asian, revealing how entrenched certain visual standards remain in defining what looks Canadian. In short, while multiculturalism remains a foundational ideal in Canada, the way it's implemented needs to evolve. If the goal is true inclusion, then the future of multiculturalism must focus not only on preserving heritage, but also on creating equal opportunity and a shared national space for everyone.